A man sits on the cold pavement, his clothes in rags, holding out a trembling hand to anyone who passes. He is entirely broken, terrified of his own shadow, and begging for survival. Just months prior, this exact same man was sitting on the 27th floor of the city's tallest skyscraper. This is Anil Malhotra, the billionaire CEO of VM Industries, a man who possessed limitless wealth, ruthless efficiency, and absolute control over his market. Curious, slightly hushed. A titan of industry doesn't lose an empire of that scale to standard market forces overnight. Anil lost his to a tiny, featureless doll made of clay. Anil's destruction follows a specific, self-inflicted logic of psychological sabotage. Anil held a dominant position in the business world. He had the expensive cars and the sprawling mansion, but he also carried a severe blind spot, a deep, consuming jealousy of his primary competitor, Naman Agarwal. When Naman's company began winning a string of major contracts, Anil's competitive drive mutated. He convinced himself that Naman was actively placing the evil eye, or Nazar, on his business, stealing his success. To regain control, Anil abandoned his corporate strategy entirely. He drove out of the city and deep into a remote, ash-covered crematorium to find a practitioner of dark rituals, an Aghori Baba. The Aghori handed him a small clay figure. He instructed Anil to pierce its chest with 3 needles, an act meant to channel immediate, devastating ruin directly onto his rival. The magic came with one unbreakable condition. The user could not feel a single drop of fear. If panic entered Anil's mind at any point, the curse would permanently reverse upon him. Anil eagerly accepted the terms. He traded his spreadsheets and risk assessments for an unpredictable, emotion-driven weapon he could never fully control. Anil drove the needles into the doll, locking in his malicious intent and signaling the start of the attack. Almost immediately, Naman's life began to fracture. His core projects collapsed, his accounts hemorrhaged capital, and his car violently crashed. Simultaneously, Anil experienced an unnatural surge of victory. He swept up the lost contracts, expanded into a larger office, and watched his profit margins climb beyond his projections. While the external ledger showed Anil dominating the market, the act of planting such concentrated malice had already begun to rot his mind from the inside out. The internal decay started with severe insomnia. After weeks without sleep, sitting alone in his high-rise office at night, Anil began to suddenly suffer from the deeply unsettling illusion that the clay doll on his desk was twitching. His subconscious guilt quickly manifested as vivid nightmares. He would fall asleep at his desk only to dream of Naman intensely smiling back at him, whispering that the magic was about to turn. By the time 2:47 a.m. arrived, Anil's sensory perception was fraying under the weight of his own panic. In the flickering office lights, his mind convinced him that the clay doll had physically turned its head. A terrified Anil picked up the figure to inspect it. The photograph pinned beneath the needles was no longer Naman's. The face looking back at him was his own. The Aghori's heavy voice echoed through the empty room, an auditory hallucination triggered by the very fear he was warned against. His terror had tripped the reversal mechanism. A mind consumed by paranoia effectively programs its own destruction. Anil had turned his most dangerous weapon completely inward. This animated diagram illustrates the total collapse of his empire over the following months. VM Industries went bankrupt, banks seized his assets, and his entire social circle vanished. Which brings us directly back to the dark, rain-slicked street. The billionaire CEO is now entirely destitute, clutching a beggar's bowl. A figure steps out of the shadows and approaches him. It is Naman, looking perfectly healthy and entirely successful. Naman states a devastating truth. He never used dark magic, he never sought revenge, and he never made a single move to harm Anil. Anil's Muin was a perfectly closed-loop system. He lost his entire empire fighting a phantom generated entirely by his own insecurity. This diagram shows the true nature of Nazar, a toxic envy that poisons its origin. As Naaman crushes the doll, the delusion shatters. The curse only had power because Anil believed he deserved punishment. Anil is left alone, screaming into the dark, entirely consumed by the psychological fire he had built for his rival. Malicious intent is a terrible strategy. It requires you to burn your own house down just to catch your neighbors on fire. True destruction rarely comes from the enemies you face on the battlefield. It comes from the traps you set for them.